I'm your host, Micah Versman, and this is the Producer Podcast. Today, Christmas is coming early as we're extending Season 3 of the show. If you heard our last episode with Chad Gunderson, you know we called that the Season 3 finale. However, we're happy to now release a surprise 10th episode to the third season. So today, we have a special roundtable discussion as we bring back previous guest Hannah Bartlett, Matthew Jordan, and Katherine Johnson to the show to discuss the topic of how do we care for our crew. Because right now in the industry, there's a potential strike going on with some of the unions, and the reasons they're striking really boil down to that issue of caring for the crew. So without further ado, let's jump in and get started. Obviously, the idea for this episode came out of seeing everything that's going on in Hollywood right now with the strike. And while I don't want to get into the nitpicky of all the issues that they're striking for, at least when I read through a lot of the issues, it really seems to come down to the aspect of just taking care of your crew. And if people were doing that, a lot of these things wouldn't be problems. So I guess maybe to start, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how, as producers, we can be setting our productions up right from the very beginning to care for the crew instead of that being like an afterthought once we get to production.
So I'll just start out by saying that I think communication is really, really key in this. So in that pre-production stage, as you're getting crew on board for your project, having a contract in place with them that clarifies a lot of those things, like how many hours the days are going to be, what's all included, how much their rate is, and sometimes, other details like how many hours are between meals or those types of things. And just to give a little bit of my background, so I do a lot of commercial and client work, so it's a lot of smaller crews, so it's not features and that type of thing. But, I'm typically working with between 3 to 11 people, right? So it's kind of in that range. And usually between, I would say 3 to 9 days long is kind of the range there of stuff that I've worked on. So just to kind of give a little bit of context for where I'm coming from with that. But I think really having it written out in the contracts is super important, and communicating with them what's expected for the project, especially when you're working in the independent Christian film world. You're going to have a whole variety of people with different expectations. Some are like, oh, I love doing this. This is a passion thing. I'm totally fine with whatever. Other people are, going to be more industry professionals and have more requirements. So talking that through in the contract stage, getting it down on paper is going to save you so much further on, things that you can't really change once you're on set as easily. So I think communicating ahead of time is really key.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I've learned probably more from mistakes than from good choices I've made. And so at least on counter column, I think there was some communication that could have been a lot better. And looking back, it's like some people are expecting one thing, other people are expecting another thing. To go off of what Hannah said, having it written out is important, and upfront talking through kind of pay expectations and expectations of how long the days are going to be and all this stuff. I haven't produced anything that's union regulated at all. And so obviously the union exists to help regulate the treating of crew. And I think that you definitely see when you're on a lower budget production how easy it is to mistreat people because you just can't afford the time or the money to be able to get people proper feeding or proper rest because you're trying to finish the filming on time and stuff like that. If you can plan your production better, to make sure that you're going to be on time and on budget, that's like the biggest thing you can do to help yourself out. Because I think looking back, we definitely could have done better on countercom with that, and it would have definitely made the experience less tiring for people. Oh my God, you know this. It's not like you weren't there.
I didn't get too many gray hairs, so, you know. So I did want to jump in just kind of off of the one thing you were talking about with, you know, how when you're not doing union projects, it's sometimes easy to mistreat crews because you're not being held to those standards. And it's definitely true. I've made some of those mistakes, but more recently I've been trying to, like, when I have projects coming up, like I had one with a minor as an actor, and so I took the time to research what are the union rules for that, and trying to get into that habit of what are the union rules and trying to follow them as closely as possible. So hopefully in the future, when I am doing a union set, it's not going to be like a complete shock to my system. Like, what? You mean I can't work my crew 20 hours, you know? Or this actor can't be on set more than 5 hours in a day or whatever. So that's something one is just interesting to read, I find, but something I've found helpful too.
I think it was interesting what Matthew was saying too about learning from our mistakes, because that's where I feel I've learned the most as well. I feel like in the early stages, Andrew and I were both very like driven go-getters. So, hey, if we're willing to work an 18-hour day, well, everybody else should be too, right? And that's definitely not how it goes. And especially a lot of these people, this is what they do all the time. You know, for Andrew and I, we're working with client projects. A lot of times it's pre-production, then we're on set for 3 to 5 days, and then, you know, we're in post-production for a little while. So we can do that for a short period of time. But I think as we did more and more projects, I think each one I learned something new from the crew. Like, hey, what are your expectations? What can we be doing better? How can we be, you know, helping you guys to have a good and positive experience on our film sets?
And most people aren't going to know their expectations or communicate them to you. So I think as a producer, it's important to be proactive. Again, this is coming from independent filmmaking, and you're working with a lot of people that are not in the typical industry. And so a phone call is enough for some people to get them to show up on your set. And that's what happens, is they come and show up on your set. But whether or not they can even be paid, I think there's some good policies to kind of have in place. You know, this is that low budget independent filmmaker mentality, but communicating about if it is paid or not is so important, because, you know, the worst thing would be for them to come expecting to get paid and they don't get paid. I mean, that's kind of like an obvious thing, but you can have several phone calls and not cover that topic. And I think right away it should be upfront. You know, this is a pro bono gig, or hey, this is gonna, you know, pay this much or whatever. This is what we can afford. Are you willing to even do that? And then, you know, let's talk about, so if it's not a paid gig, you know, this is like someone's willing to come and work for free. The very minimum to do for them is to, you know, give them all their meals and give them a place to sleep, because, you know, basically like trying to do everything you can to like make it so that they don't at least have to spend money out of their pocket to be there. If you can cover their travel. If they're willing to provide their own travel, that's that's great, but you want to offer that if you can. And along the lines of somebody coming and working for free, oddly enough, I think the tendency when somebody is working for free is to overwork them, because you automatically, I would just say the people who are working for free are automatically in that category of people who are willing to do anything it takes for the project. And so in some ways it's great working with people like that, but then on the other side, they're not going to go like strike if you work them for too long, And so that's where you have to be extra careful on your part. It's like, the least I can do is make that plan and give them rest and give them, a limited day, because this is almost like, I guess if I was thinking about a good way to put it, sometimes our respect level and our carefulness to obey the procedures is higher for somebody who's like union. But in all honesty, it should be higher for somebody who's not getting paid working on my project. Because like that's even more of a sacrifice on their part. And so I should treat them arguably better than I would treat somebody who's required, who's in a union, who I'm required to treat a certain way. It's like we should go and try to treat people even better if they're making that sacrifice for us. Way easier said than done. I just throwing that out there.
Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree, and that was something I was gonna say in regards to that too. I think whether they're coming on as passion project or even just getting paid less than their required rates, I think a lot of times what I've tried to do is have make sure all the meals are great and that the crafty is really, really good and that the place that we have for them to stay is really nice too. Not super expensive or anything like that, but just nice, something that's comfortable. And just going above and beyond in, if we're not able to pay their full rates, hey, what other ways are maybe a little bit cheaper, but still show them that we really care? Because I think someone can tell if you really care about them as a person and as a crew member or not. So I think finding all of those little ways to listen, to care about them. A lot of times ahead of time, I'll ask, hey, do you have any favorite snacks? Do you have any allergies? Any favorite, drinks on set or Gatorade or whatever, And so just kind of, seeing how I can ask those questions and take care of them, especially if they're not getting their full rates, like you were saying.
All right. That all sounded good. Definitely some good takeaways there. So another aspect I wanted to bring up, because obviously you can plan as amazing as possible. You're never going to be a producer that doesn't ever have a day that ends up going overtime for whatever reason or where something doesn't go wrong. So when you have those moments and now your day is going longer, there's this aspect and it's unexpected come up. How can we as producers make sure the crew is still feeling cared for and we're not just shoving them up against a wall it's not our fault that it rained all day and we gotta add on 4 hours at the end of the day to get this done?
I would say working as someone who both produces but then also ADs frequently on features, when things get out of hand, producers are the ones that the AD usually goes to and says, hey, look, things are the crew, this is how the crew is feeling. The AD telling the producer that, and the producer needs to listen. If the AD says the team they're really exhausted, they're not going to be able to put in extra hours, then the producer needs to make adjustments immediately, and actually listen to that information instead of oh, we'll work through it, it's fine. No, that person is put in authority by you to keep watch over people. So we need to listen when that information reaches our ears, especially when it's coming through the proper channels. That's not a disgruntled person sitting in a corner saying, I can't do this. That's someone whose job is to keep everyone safe, saying, hey, I think, too bad. We're just going to have to cut it. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if a crew knows that the producer's goal is their safety, they are willing to voluntarily do things that they might not if their safety is just being thrown to the wayside. So if a producer and an AD team says, hey guys, we only have this location for this day, can we chip in 2 hours? And if everybody's like, sure, and then if there are 3 people who are like, I have to drive home tonight, I need to leave now to get home safely, then as a producer, you're like, good, goodbye, drive home, be safe.
Easier said than done.
It is easier said than done.
No, to tag on that, I think the idea that came to mind was opt-in, like when you have to make a hard decision and say you're like, okay, we're just gonna try to go 3 more hours, to make sure there's opt-in from your crew and especially your department heads. So like going to each person and saying, hey, we're gonna try to go 3 more hours, is that okay? And especially if your leaders are on board with that, if they're okay with that, if they think their individual crew teams are good with that, then that's good. If they're all kind of like, no, that's not going to work, then let them have an input in what's the better option. What would you do if you're in this predicament? This is the predicament we're in. But then ultimately it's your job as the producer to basically make sure it happens no matter what. And so how do you sometimes, as like, I remember one time it was the camera team that really wanted another bit of time on a certain scene, and it was not going to work with the rest of our schedule, and they were just really pushing for that, whatever. And or even they said like, we can't do this many scenes in 12 hours. And so, instead of being like, okay, we'll go 14 hours, I had to be like, yes, we're going to do that many scenes in 12 hours. And even if you just have to stick the camera on a tripod and we do it like drama style, like at this point, you don't have a choice when it comes down to it. Like I had to say, we're sticking with the time versus we're going to try to figure out another day to add on for everybody. Like people can adjust, and they the quality drops a little bit if you have to make time sacrifices, but as a producer, that's your call, and you really don't have to, you shouldn't worry about that. That's the director's job to fret about.
Yeah, and I think having some of those things thought about ahead of time can be super helpful. Like, I know there's things you just really cannot help on set, but in the pre-production stage, again, if you talk to your crew about what do you charge for overtime, what are you comfortable with, and then you also talk with director, AD, whoever else, heads of departments, that's important, saying, hey, if it comes to this point where something happens, our priority is to take care of the crew, so just so you know ahead of time, this is kind of so that you're not in the moment and all stressed and being like, what do we do? How do we take care of the crew and get this shot done and do this and this? So just communicating that ahead of time with the director, with the AD, with the heads of department, I think can be really, really helpful. And at the end of the day, I think, like you guys were saying, it might come down to, we just need to put the crew and their safety first, especially as a Christian. Like, that's our job, is to be thinking of others and caring for them. And so sometimes the project may have to suffer because of that, but I think long term, that's the better decision. Those people are going to want to work for you again because they see that you genuinely care about them and about their safety.
Yeah. So I had another example I wanted to throw out along these lines. This is somebody once illustrated it to me as a gear, and like that you're this how to say, like almost a series of gears. I'm doing a bad job describing this. Basically, the people that are in charge. So say like the producer and the director. It's like this big gear in the middle of the whole production, and everybody else. The further down the hierarchy, the lower down the hierarchy you go, the gears are attached to the main gear, but they get further and further out. And so think about like the assistant director is like a small gear on this big gear. And so and then his PA team or her PA team is like another even smaller gear on that small gear. And that is very mathematical something way to put this, but it's like you can make a small decision as the person in charge, and you literally, your gear, you turn like just a little bit, but then it's actually like spinning some people further out like 10 times in a circle. Because of the way gears work, it's like sometimes you put the right gears together and it's like one little turn from one gear is going to like make this one go faster. And then that one going faster makes this one go even faster. And so it's kind of this visual of like one little change you do. Like, we're going to change locations for this scene. Okay? It's like, it's tomorrow, we're changing locations. No big deal, right? And it's like, everybody, you have no idea how much work has gone into that one, preparing for that one scene at that one location. A classic example of this is like a change in the script. It's like, oh, we're going to cut half the dialogue in that scene. Or, oh, we're going to like change this. Instead of he picks up this item, we're going to now call for a totally different prop in the scene that's going to then play a role. Like, the production design team is like spinning like this because you just made like this little adjustment in what's going on. And so when that happens, because it's gonna happen sometimes, you can't say like never do that, because like this is filmmaking, you're gonna do that at some point. And I did realize, like, you realize that, and obviously you try to avoid that as much as possible. Sadly, when you are working with creative people, that's going to happen, and you're going to end up making those little adjustments because people are always wanting to make changes, and the director's in charge of the creative vision, so you have to go with that. And you have, like, to an extent, it's like my job is to keep everything in mind, but then ultimately make sure the director can fulfill the vision for the movie. And so say something happens and you make that little adjustment, and all of a sudden you're like, this is going to be so hard for the rest of the crew to actually, like, I know that we're literally making a big change that's going to really rock some people's boats. I think the most important thing in producing, especially at that point, is to recognize that that's happening, and to be very, very humble in your approach to the people you have to talk to about that. I remember going to the production design team because of a pretty significant change we made. I think it might have been like even a scene we cut that they had been like working hard on. I just had to like apologize to them, because at that point I wasn't gonna like say the production design team is the boss of the project. At that point they're not. Like, they're working for the production, so whatever the production needs, people need to learn to go with the flow, but it's gonna be hard sometimes. And so to keep try to walk in humility of just being like, this, I'm really, really sorry. I know this really stinks for you guys. I apologize that we had to make this change. And just, let me know if there's anything I can do to help you guys. And just like, those are hard conversations to have, and people don't take things well, but you just gotta like try your best to smooth things over, so that even though someone's world is flying, it's like you try to slow it down just enough so they can still breathe and continue working on the project.
I like that illustration. That's a unique way to to look at it, but it makes a whole lot of sense.
And another thing in regards to that too, I think it's important to understand what the different departments of your crew have to go through. So as a producer, I know, Micah, you've had some crew on your podcast, and asking them like, hey, what are some ways that it's helpful as crew? What are some tips or advice you can give us producers? And so I think talking to people, asking them questions, not necessarily while you're on set, but like in between times, like, hey, like what are some things in general that would be helpful for me to know as a producer, or even jumping in on a project if you can, and doing some of that yourself. Like, hey, I'm on experience. What is it like to be in this department or whatever, and how I can be a better producer because of that, because you're able to actually kind of get down to earth and learn what it's like to be in those different positions. And then at the end of the day, if you do end up, going overtime or whatever, the buck kind of stops with you as a producer. So if you need to be the one to pull a couple of extra hours so that somebody else can go home or can get their sleep or whatever, you need to be the one to do that. So sometimes it's going to come down to that, where, we've had that happen before, where we contracted with some crew to work for X amount of hours, and then we realized we needed some extra stuff, so Andrew and I, or whatever, we're the ones that have to go and make sure that gets done. And that's gonna, it's harder to do like on a feature and stuff, but there are still things that you can do as the producer, working with your AD or whatever, to figure out, okay, we had this issue today, and we decided to let people go home and do whatever. How can we take a couple extra hours tonight to schedule out the next couple days, or to change some things, or whatever you need to do? At the end of the day, kind of comes down to you to figure that out and make it happen.
I did have one other point or topic, I guess you could say, I wanted to make sure to get to, which is, as a producer, obviously, Katherine, you talked about kind of how hopefully things are coming up the chain of command through department heads and the AD and then to the producer. But sometimes it might not be something that like is causing a problem for the whole crew. It might be something just for one individual or one department. So how can we as producers work to address that in a good way? Whether that means maybe the person, just can't continue working on the project, or maybe it means there's a resolution, to keep them on the project.
Really, it all comes down to relationships. And ultimately, our goal as a producer, if we're approaching everything from a biblical perspective, is that, the gospel is first. So whether we're making a Christian film or a non-Christian film, whatever, our lives are the most important thing, and how we act is a reflection of what we believe in. And so Philippians 1:27a, let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ. So in the way that we're treating other people, we should be as Christ would be. We should be serving those around us. And I think as a producer, the most important thing is if your crew knows that the movie is not the end all for you, or the commercial or the media project, whatever it is. Ultimately, what is most important is that person, and not the movie. You're not doing everything for the movie. God doesn't need your movie. He just doesn't. When you stand before, him on the judgment day, it's going to be about your life and about your heart. And so when it's dealing with individual crew members, I think it still kind of comes down to producers should be excellent listeners, like extremely good listeners. Being approachable. I think as a producer, I would say the most important thing is to create a way that people know that they can approach you, like anyone can. I worked with one gentleman he had a notebook that was a private notebook because he was a very busy man. And if anyone had an issue, they would go and write their issue in his notebook. It was very private. And then he would go through everything when he had time, because he was a very busy man. But he came back to anything that was written in his notebook, he addressed within 24 hours. So as a producer, I think being approachable and then figuring out how to make that work with your timeline, whether you let the crew know, like, hey, you can text me or you can email me to this email, or hey, grab me at a meal time, whatever. Making sure that you're a good listener and that you're a servant like Christ. And then from a practical standpoint, creating a time frame for people to be able to approach you.
I would just tag on there Matthew 20:24 through 28. Jesus says, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Their high officials exercise authority over them. Not with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to serve, but to serve. To be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom. Our job is to serve, not to be served. And as a producer, you are the top dog, and you kind of have the power over everybody. But the biblical way to approach leadership is that the more authority you have, the more you try to serve other people with that authority. So it's kind of saying, yeah, I have all this power, but like, how can I use that to benefit the weakest person on set? How can I use that authority to help somebody out who's having a hard day? And I just 100% what Katherine was saying. We had a situation where, one person really had an issue with where they were being launched, and it was not something everyone cared about. And I just prayed about it, and I kind of defaulted to the person who had the problem with it, and no one cared. And it kind of made, it blessed some other people that it affected as well. But, you just, if people don't care about it as much as one person does, you still got to care about it for them, and that shows love to them. And you just keep doing that as much as you can.
Yeah, wow, those are really good thoughts. I think communicating that to the crew in a pre-production meeting or before the set starts is really important too, because people are coming from all different backgrounds and used to different types of sets and whatever else. And so saying up front, we want our set to be something where you're not struggling with bitterness or unforgiveness because you felt like you couldn't talk to me. Like, no, I want you to be able to come up as soon as there's an issue, as soon as it's possible to do so. I'm open to that. I want to listen. I want to hear what you have to say. So I think letting them know that ahead of time too is really key, just so that they feel comfortable with that, and kind of talking about it right off the bat.
And kind of what Hannah was saying, if your pre-production is really good and you've been communicating with pre-production, there's already a relationship there, even if you're working with a brand new crew member that's never worked with you before. And so there's already a little bit of rapport there, hopefully, and they see that you're planning ahead and trying to actually see problems before they happen.
All boils down to relationship and communication.
Yes, it sure does. All right. Well, we have just a couple minutes left here, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of the Producer Podcast. So thank you, Matthew, Hannah, and Katherine, for once again coming back on and chatting with us about this topic.
Absolutely. Thanks for having all of us.
Yeah, thank you.
And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Producer Podcast. Until next time, make sure to subscribe to the Producer Podcast, and thanks for listening.